Okay, let's get started, because really the value of this whole process is actually what we're going to do at the end, which is part of the ECHO project, and it's the case discussion. And so we will be going over briefly the framework around suicide prevention in schools, but really it's going to be, we're going to learn so much actually from each other. We don't have any disclosures or conflicts of interest to go over. Besides that, we do have funding through our grants. The main learning objectives that Megan and I are going to be talking about are: one is the value of procedures and having them in place, the 6 steps for assessing and managing suicide risk, and then some guidelines around post-intervention support and procedures. Next slide. So the challenge with suicide prevention in schools is you have the school setting, you might have a school-based health setting as well. You have HIPAA, you have FERPA, you have to figure out how the police may be involved, how the ambulance comes in. So there's a lot of actually thinking about how this is going to run. Even within our psychiatry clinic, we have a crisis procedure, and we're always updating it and revisiting it every time there's a situation that happens. So the SAMHSA suicide prevention has had this in place, and to outline a toolkit for high schools around suicide prevention. And this is all theory, but and provides a framework, but the nuts and bolts and how to and actually put it into place, that is the challenge. And I believe there's many experts in this setting today that can provide a lot more information as well. So next slide. The key is that the main procedures to think about are for prevention, intervention, and postvention. There was the Assembly Bill 2246 that said in 2017 and 18, 7th to 12th, that every school must adopt a suicide prevention protocol, and then to keep it up at least every 5 years. Though I really think everyone should revisit it any time there's a crisis that occurs. Okay, next slide. So the first step in any procedure setting it up is to identify who's going to be involved in it, the stakeholders, who's going to be the charge for the crisis response, and mapping out your resources as well. Just determining how you're going before we actually go out and identify or implement. We need to have these procedures in place, and then once you have this screening plan in place, then you can actually go out and do the work. And then really just this is an outline basically of the steps in going about and doing the suicide prevention and intervention. And so it includes all the things from communication to the students, to the staff. Next slide. One of the things about prevention and education really is the first thing, it's okay to talk about suicide. And I think this is across the board around mental health and stigma and reducing it. And it is very, there's a lot of things and emotions that come up in our day-to-day world, in the community, but in schools, and even in mental health and physical health. But we need to really emphasize how it is important to ask about suicide. Someone could look very happy and getting straight A's and being really active in sports, but they could still feel suicidal. And one of the key things in the new guidelines is that we don't just screen. We used to just screen in primary care. If you're depressed, then you ask about suicide. But no, if you're anxious, you could be suicidal. If you're depressed, you could be suicidal. You could be doing great, and you could a youth could still feel suicidal. Okay, next slide. And then talking points about suicide. If a death has happened by suicide, really these are the outline ideas of talking about suicide and thinking about how you would create education to families, to the students, and to the teachers about suicide. So this is just the general framework in talking about it, and making sure that a lot of times what comes up around suicide and when there's a death is you might feel like, oh, if I would have said something to this person, maybe they wouldn't have died. And really addressing that head on and talking about these things. There is always the information about when a death has happened by suicide is not to actually talk about the method. And there's a lot of educational information about how to deal with the media. And then it's always encouraging help seeking and providing all the crisis information as well in all communications. Okay, next slide. So in the prevention section and trying to identify, well, who could be at risk for suicide, it's really when there's a change, and there's a change in sleep, attitude, behaviors, grades. And this is a cool website where you can kind of quickly see and it outlines some of the other things that they might be in. If there's been increased substance use, if there was a recent major stressor or breakup, that's the time to reach out and ask, how are you doing? Are you doing okay? Have you been having thoughts about, wanting to die or to kill yourself? And we, we try to normalize a lot of times by saying when people are feeling these big things happen to them, these are some emotions that could come up for you. Okay, next slide. And then within the school setting, the actual suicide assessment, to identify who and the team could do a suicide assessment is it's a professional with mental health training. It could be the school nurse, as the school psychologist, a social worker or counselor, and if those aren't available, you would work within the community to find somebody to help complete that assessment. And it's just, not all mental health professionals have been trained to assess suicide risk, so it's checking in on that as well. And next slide. This is where Megan takes over.
So thanks, Shelly. There are a lot of options that are available to you for how to actually assess for suicidality. There are kind of brief screeners that you can use to kind of understand whether or not you need to do more intensive or involved assessment, and kind of thinking of it kind of through these layers, right, of doing initial screeners, and then if somebody is flagging for risk, making sure that you're doing some follow-up assessment that's a little more thorough and rigorous. Go to the next slide, please. And this is an example of a kind of very initial screener that you can use to kind of understand who should be assessed further. So essentially asking these 4 top questions, focus on what's happening currently in the youth's life. And if they're reporting yes to any of these 4 ones, so wishing they were dead, having thoughts that they others would be better off if they were not alive, thoughts of killing themselves, actual attempts, then you could do for just could merit more assessment. We'll continue to the next slide. And then you can think about safety plan development potentially as like 6 concrete steps. And we'll just talk about these very lightly, but happy to answer questions about them at the end too. So the first thing that you want to do is to actually assess suicide risk. It could be using one of those screeners or the one that we just showed before. Ideally at the beginning of a session or when you're meeting with the youth and after, since risk can change over the course of an hour even. You want to assess the present moment problem. So a lot of folks kind of will understandably so, that suicide risk can come from negative events that happened in the early life of youths. But what we really encourage you all to do is to take stock of those, really explore how they're impacting risk and problems that the youth is experiencing in the present moment. And then once you know what those problems are, then trying to actually address them and problem solve them. So less on the kind of talk therapy, exploring what's happening, and more on the let's actually get in this together and talk about what we can do to address the problem. And thinking stylistically too, some data also suggests that how we talk about suicide matters. Shelly was saying that in a post-death situation, but also when you're working with a youth who's suicidal. So being very active, so giving them active suggestions. Why don't you do this? Why don't you try this? Instead of kind of letting them lead. Or at least like kind of, yes, being quite involved and problem solving oriented, and then also generating hope. Also reducing environmental risk, which we don't have a lot of time to talk about today, but is engaging in like means restriction and supporting the youth to actually get rid of potential means that they have for suicide or self-harming. That can be a very useful thing to do inside of your time with them. And then ideally you develop some kind of safety plan with them if you thought that there was risk on the table. And the important thing about developing the safety plan too is making sure that there's commitment to actually following through on it, and then troubleshooting that if you're noticing that it's a little low or you're not quite sure. And then scheduling a follow-up contact is also quite important. And then when you're developing a safety plan, just kind of some things to keep in mind. A lot of time for providers, for family members, for anybody really, talking about suicide is stressful. It's anxiety provoking. We feel awkward. We're not sure how to do it. We're scared that if we ask, then they might actually feel more suicidal. We know that that's actually not the case, that asking about it directly is the best way to reduce and prevent suicides. So encourage you to actually manage your own feelings and to be calm, direct, and also active when talking about it. So no need to kind of skirt around it. It's important to also make sure what we give attention to and what we don't give attention to. So for example, if a youth is coming in saying that they engaged in a suicide attempt or cut in the last week or this week, making sure that you are giving attention to how they're feeling on the inside, as opposed to actually saying, oh, it's okay that you cut, or it's okay that you had an attempt. More like, oh, it sounds like you're really struggling, or it sounds like you might have been feeling X. Tell me more about what was going on. So really trying to understand the inner experience of the youth and trying to give attention to that as opposed to the actual behaviors themselves. There are also data that say that like being firm and saying like, I don't, I think that this is a maladaptive solution. I think you can get through this. I think there are other ways that you could cope that would be more helpful and more aligned with the life that you want to live, that can actually be very helpful when suicide risk is on the table. And then also really just using your intuition to develop a safety plan, because in that context with the youth more than somebody not in that context does. So really kind of following your own gut to help guide what should go in that safety plan. Next slide, please. And as part of assessment too, and weaving these pieces into the safety plan as well, thinking about risk factors as well as protective factors. So risk factors could look more like in the moment risk factors, which we really want you to keep in mind. What's the intensity of the suicidal ideation in the moment? For example, if they were to leave the classroom, what is the likelihood that you think that they would actually engage in an attempt? Do they have means in place that they might actually be able to use to hurt themselves? And how lethal are those means / how accessible are they? And then you can kind of think about group them potentially to low, moderate, high. And we have some tools that we can share with you to kind of help guide based on these risk factors, how intense the risk level might be. You can also assess for protective factors. So things like having social support present in their environment, having access to social support in the short term, being connected to a school counselor or to a therapist, having reasons for living, spirituality. So really kind of understanding what is also protecting them or preventing them from engaging in a suicidal behavior. And then you can kind of weight these and formulating your safety plan as well. The next slide. I'll hand it back to you, Shelly.
Okay, so after there were several deaths from suicide in Palo Alto, the Stanford psychiatrist, Dr. Yoshi, Linda Lenore, who is a district school nurse from Santa Clara County, and a local pediatrician, Amy Hennigan, and several others created the Herd Alliance. So it's a true collaboration among primary care and mental health professionals, educational professionals, and with the Stanford Hospital to address suicide prevention. And they created the Herd Alliance, and it's continuing to go on through grant funding. And they provided a lot of actual nuts and bolts to how to implement the framework outlines. And so this is one of them where it talks through if there isn't a suicide risk at school, low, moderate, high, and how it was brought to the attention. How would the school respond, and how does it get notified? So it kind of walks you through in an algorithm of how to look at it. Next slide. And this is just continuing to, if there was an actual attempt at school, how would the school and staff respond and to the situation? And including to the key part that they continue to emphasize is, how do you notify and making sure you're documenting all this as well. Next slide. So the other part of the procedures to look at is postvention, because postvention is actually prevention. And we've heard about suicide contagion. It is real. I think that this time of year is a challenging time in schools and high schools because college announcements are happening, and it's a stressful time for the young people. So having a really clear plan of what to do after a suicide death happens is to really create this postvention and having it understood and up to date as much as possible. Really making sure that you identify like who communicates with the family, and understanding what they want to have communicated out. How do you respond to media? You definitely want to have it so announcements at the school are not made over the loudspeaker. They're made in the classroom setting. How do you notify the teachers and prepare them, and giving them allowances to kind of do what feels right for their classroom, if they want to do the announcement or they want a counselor to do the announcement, and giving some flexibility around that. They outline a lot to do with how do you, do a grief period and memorization. They really kind of indicate that you should keep the memorization as standard care across any person who had died in the school, to have it consistent and to be the same, and not to make it a physical memorial, so people are reminded by that. And next slide, May. I'm really helping to get to the 10:20 mark, Lauren. This is the just an outline of the postvention procedure that the Herd Alliance had written out, to kind of step by step through it, is an example. And then next slide. And then this is a whole toolkit that the Herd Alliance put together, which gives more nuts and bolts around the intervention, prevention, intervention, and postvention. A lot to do with helping to build out, social and emotional supports, how to talk about grief and grief supports as well. So it gives a lot more details in this guide. Next slide. This is just an example of some of the information from the guide, which is notifying parents if there was a suicide risk for a young person at school. And it's just really making sure to be, sensitively, around the family's culture and understanding, and trying to find out how they might respond. And the key part is of all suicide prevention is lethal means counseling. So really checking into and asking and not having any judgment if there is a gun in the home, and then really working with them to find a way to keep the gun locked up or in a different setting. And that's the key intervention about suicide is lethal means counseling. So an emphasis on all around on your assessment and then how you communicate with the parents. Next slide. And then this is a tool that they also have from the Herd Alliance, is around how to support grieving students. It's a general outline that includes for teachers and administrators and for students. It talks about for if there was grief in all aspects, if it was from a suicide death or from someone who died for other reasons. But one of the things they do give examples of what to say and not to say. And they also, you know, really emphasize the importance of working with the family and how they want it communicated, working with the young person and how when they return back to school, how do they want people to respond? They talk about the empty chair phenomena feeling, and how do you work together to as the student and the teacher and to kind of address that. Next slide. And these are other resources that were provided in there about grief resources.